Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and I'm here to bring you another video on the history of Magic's banned and restricted list. People seem to enjoy the first installment of this, and I'm happy about that because I really enjoyed making that first video. You can expect about 2 of these a month now here on the Aether Hub. Last time we talked about the very first banned and restricted list that Wizards ever made on January 25th, 1994. 1994 was a busy year for the banned and restricted list, which makes sense. It was Wizards' first time using such a list, so they made frequent changes to it. Some of these were unrestricting cards that they realized weren't necessary to restrict. We talked about that a little bit last time. Some of the cards that were banned and restricted with that first announcement remained on the list for less than a month, like Orcish Oriflamme and Rook Egg. Others were restricted for a little bit longer, but ultimately taken off the list, like Icy Manipulator, Dingus Egg, and Gauntlet of Might. Less than 2 months after the first banned and restricted announcement, on March 23, 1994, Wizards made their next announcement that actually added things to the banned and restricted list, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Just like last time, we're going to talk about every card and the context that led to each of them being banned or restricted. No new sets came out between the first and second announcement, so the cards that were added to the list were largely cards that Wizards realized they had missed with their first announcement. Here are the cards that were newly restricted by this announcement: Channel, Copy Artifact, Demonic Tutor, Regrowth, and Wheel of Fortune. Unlike the first banned and restricted announcement, I think the restriction of the majority of these still makes sense to us today. Nevertheless, let's discuss each of them in order and talk about what got them restricted. Let's talk about Channel first. This is probably the biggest mistake that Wizards made with their first banned and restricted list. They restricted some cards with that announcement that they didn't need to, like Orcish Oriflamme and Ali from Cairo, but failing to restrict Channel is a way bigger mistake than that. It's an utterly ridiculous and broken Magic card. For 2 green mana, you got to pay life to add mana to your mana pool. That meant any amount of life. That's a completely broken Magic card, and it certainly still is that today, so the fact they missed it is quite surprising. Channel actually made up Magic's first 2-card instant win combo when combined with Fireball. This is where the website and Pro Team Channel Fireball got their name, by the way. In a world of Moxen and other fast mana, casting Channel on turn 1 and fireballing your opponent for 20 was a possibility, and by turn 3 it wasn't difficult at all. Even after it was restricted, there was no reason for people not to play singleton copies of the card, since playing it on turn 2 could be so backbreaking. Even if you weren't casting Fireball, you could basically dump your entire hand on the table for 2 mana and pay some life. Even after it was restricted, Channel saw play, picking up 3 top 8s at Worlds in '94 and 1 at Worlds in 1995. All the decks running it also ran Fireball, of course, because who doesn't want the chance for a free win? Even singleton copies of Channel became too much for the game, though, and it was banned out of the newly created Standard and Vintage formats in November of 1995. Next, let's look at Copy Artifact. There are sort of 2 groups of cards in this banned and restricted announcement. 2 of the cards were restricted based on their power level. I think that's Channel and Wheel of Fortune. And the other 3 were cards that were banned because Wizards felt that they undermined the restricted list itself. They all allowed you to reuse or copy or find cards on the restricted list, something Wizards didn't want happening. Copy Artifact could copy Black Lotus, Time Vault, and Soul Ring, as well as the Moxen, and that wasn't something that Wizards felt was very fair, since those cards were restricted for a reason. Another possible reason for the inclusion of this card was the fact that the set Antiquities, a set built around an artifact theme, was just about to come out, about a month after this announcement, and the ability to copy artifacts for 2 mana was going to be way too powerful once that was printed, if it wasn't already too powerful, and it probably was. We will talk more about the powerful artifacts of Antiquities that required bannings and restrictions in the next video. All that said, Copy Artifact was eventually unrestricted a few years later in 1997. Next, we have the best tutor in all of Magic, Demonic Tutor. For only 2 mana, you get to grab any card out of your deck. While this is certainly quite powerful, the reasons behind restricting this card weren't exactly based on power. Not directly, anyway. The problem was, after the first banned and restricted announcement, people could just shove 4 Demonic Tutors in their deck, making it so they effectively had 5 copies even of their restricted cards. Like Copy Artifact, this sort of negates the banned and restricted list itself, so Wizards thought it was wise to make it so that the tutor could also be a singleton copy only. Demonic Tutor is still restricted in Vintage today and is one of the cards to spend the longest time on the restricted list in Magic's history. Next, let's look at Regrowth. Of all the cards that were restricted on March 23, 1994, this is the one that is the biggest head-scratcher for people who play the game today. 2 mana to return a card from your graveyard to your hand isn't really a big deal to us now. I mean, we have cards like Eternal Witness and Den Protector in much more recent sets, and they have this effect and a body because they're creatures. And while those cards are always quite good, they weren't ever in a conversation about getting banned or restricted. We recently even had a common spell printed that is comparable to Regrowth and Grapple with the Past. It costs the same, is an instant instead of a sorcery, Mills 3 cards from your library, giving you even more choices, and while it can only get you creatures or lands from your yard, it has a pretty comparable power level to Growth, thanks to the other bonuses it has. And no one was worried about it either. It's still in standard right now. So why restrict Regrowth? Well, like Copy Artifact and Demonic Tutor, Regrowth kind of made the restricted list look silly. You could cast Ancestral Recall or Time Walk and then get it back with Regrowth. Same with your Black Lotus. Wizards was trying to avoid people casting cards on the restricted list more than once per game, and Regrowth got in the way of that. So basically, Regrowth got restricted because of the power level of the cards that it could bring back from the graveyard, not because of its own power level. Regrowth remained on the restricted list a very long time though, mostly because Vintage became the only format it was legal in, and the power level of cards there is very high too. However, it was finally unrestricted in May of 2013. Now that it's unrestricted, it doesn't really see any play, though you can find it in the occasional Storm deck, which can use the card to get back a card with Storm and recast it, which usually just ends the game, but it hasn't really done much in those decks in recent years. The final restricted card we have to look at is in the same category as Channel, a ridiculously powerful card that Wizards missed with their first announcement, Wheel of Fortune. For 3 mana, the wheel makes both you and your opponent lose their hand and draw 7 cards. That's a lot of card draw for 3 mana, even if it is symmetrical. Wizards realized that Time Twister needed to be restricted with their very first announcement. It is even part of the Power 9, and the 2 cards are very similar, so it is a bit strange they didn't think to restrict the wheel with their first announcement. The 2 are admittedly not quite identical, with the Twister being a bit different because it also shuffles your hand and graveyard into your library instead of making you discard. The reason both of these cards are so powerful despite being symmetrical is because you get the first crack at playing all the new cards you just drew, often giving you a big advantage over your opponent. This was a great card to cast when you were running out of gas and your opponent was building up too much card advantage. If your opponent already has several more cards in hand than you, casting Wheel of Fortune is then pretty much all upside because you are putting you and your opponent at the same number of cards in hand, which is an area where your opponent previously held a clear advantage. Wheel of Fortune remains restricted in Vintage today, which is probably a good thing. This card is already stupid good, but imagine it in Reanimator or Dredge decks. In addition to restricting those 5 cards, the March 23, 1994 announcement also banned a card that had previously only been restricted, making it only the second non-anti card to be banned after Shahrazad, Time Vault. This also means it was the first card to be banned purely due to its power, because the anti cards in Shahrazad were banned because they made Magic a worse game to many people. Time Vault is banned because it turns out having a repeatable source of extra turns is insane. The Vault does have a cool design coming into play tapped, but after the turn you play it, you can just tap it for an extra turn. It then remains tapped unless you opt to skip your turn. Problem was, there were several different ways to untap Time Vault without skipping that extra turn, namely Twiddle. Time Vault has a more interesting history than pretty much any card that has ever been banned, I think. In 1996, Wizards errated the text to do what it was originally intended to do, according to them. The wording was now, does not untap as normal. If Time Vault is tapped and does not have a time counter, you may skip your turn to untap Time Vault and put a time counter on it. Remove the time counter from Time Vault to take an additional turn immediately before the next normal turn. This is pretty unique to us today, as Wizards never errata cards in a way that changes their functionality, and it's partly because of what was going to happen with Time Vault. This meant, though, that Twiddle would no longer work because it needed a time counter now, which can only be gained if you skip the turn. This returned Time Vault to its restricted status. People still found a way to break it, though, this time not until 2005. This was with Flame Fusillade, and what it abused instead of the actual taking of extra turns was constantly untapping and tapping Time Vault. Time Vault, after being broken again, was restored to its original wording as Wizards realized it could be broken no matter what, and it remains on the restricted list in Vintage to this day. That does it for this look back into the history of Magic's ban and restricted list. In the next video, we will talk about the cards that were added to the list after the printing of the new expansion Antiquities. Remember to like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.